So, hi everybody. We're waiting for our guests and our co-host to join us. Good morning, Dr. Nan, and I'd like you to say hi to my husband and my dog, Jilly Dog.
Hi.
Hi. So happy Friday. I'm very excited about our guest today. Before we get started, I'm telling you a little bit about Anna. Here's
Good
Maureen, Dr.
morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. It's
Happy
cold up here in
Friday.
New
I'm trying to
York.
get the right angle here. Little back here. Happy Friday. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? It's cold up here in New York.
It's cold and it's winter and it's cold, but I think today we'll warm some things up
Ooh,
here
I do too.
by having a really hot conversation about a hot topic.
Yeah.
Anna Lee is a superstar.
Yes,
And
she is.
before I can give you a little spiel before we get started, I met her because I'm a sex researcher and I'm on top of all of the things that come out that are new and interesting. So Anna Lee, we got Limor joining us here. She sent a request to be, okay, so we're having a little technical problems.
Nan, I was going to say, I think I met her briefly with you at a conference because you were asking her if you could get a vibrator without metal in it so you could use it in your MRI.
Hello.
Oh, there's Limor, yes.
Hello,
So
everyone.
Anna Lee was, she is the Forbes 30 Under 30 rock star.
Awesome.
Inventor, founder of the world's first vibrator that collects data. So I'm going to see if where is she? Are you joining? I'm sure she'll be on. Let me, where do you add somebody? Hold on, let me make sure she's on here. So I'm going to invite her again. Lion. Lioness. I'm inviting them again. I invited her again. All right.
Limor, how are you this morning?
Thank you.
Hello. Hi.
Anna's in the house.
Hello.
Oh,
Good morning.
I was just talking you up, Anna,
Oh, that's
about
so
what
nice.
a rock star you are.
Oh, that's
as a inventor, as a creator, as a CEO, as a Forbes 30 Under 30, and that you created the world's first vibrator that collects data on orgasms.
Yay! For science, and
So
on the name of
exciting.
science.
And I do believe that your commitment is not just to sexual health, but seeing sexual health as a big part of wellness, overall wellness. Yeah.
Totally.
So maybe we can start by Anna telling us a little about you, and then I'm really interested to kind of take your pulse on how you're feeling about women and sex and what's happening with politics and how that's going to affect us.
Totally. So I'm Anna. That was such a nice introduction. It's so nice to meet you all. So we have a vibrator called the Lioness. It's the first and only biofeedback vibrator that gives you orgasm data. So what we're measuring is involuntary pelvic floor contraction. So how the vagina or anal muscles squeeze and relax involuntarily. And so it's one of the best indicators for arousal and orgasms. So you'll see a very unique pattern that happens during an orgasm. We've been doing this, I went to a panel with the Kinsey Institute yesterday, and I listened to them talk about some of the research they've been doing. And I was just telling them, I think this is about to be our 10-year anniversary of our company being since we started the company. And it's been cool to kind of just try to expand the research around especially female sexual function and kind of the uniqueness that happens with, I think, female orgasms, and then also like what we define as an orgasm, how it changes over time. And then so it's been kind of interesting also as well just to look at the pulse of how much I think sex tech has changed, how much it's changed in terms of how we view sexuality, how we view pleasure and all of that. But yeah, happy to continue talking about it.
So how did you get into this business to begin
That's a good question.
I mean, You're an engineer, right?
Yeah, my background's in mechanical engineering. I was actually working at Amazon after I graduated college, working on like hardware devices, so like the Kindles. I worked on the Amazon Dash button. So I actually I grew up in Korea till I was 7, and then moved to the U.S. But I grew up in a very religious, conservative family. We never talked about sex growing up, and I was just very scared of my body. Like well into my 20s, I very much felt like my body wasn't part of my, like, that it was like deserving of pleasure, or like things like that was anything sexual was very, very scary to me. So I never thought in my life that I would actually end up being in this world, or like, yeah, I don't know. I think it's like so fun to have looked back for 10 years being like, wow, I can't believe now like this is where my life has gone, and like how exciting it, and how I think this is like my bread and butter and passion. But I was at Amazon, and I think there was a moment where I just was like, like I just feel like there aren't products that are really designed for women in mind. And so a lot of times when we're building even hardware products at Amazon, whenever we call a product unisex, but the designers and the engineers tend to be all men, I just realized that the products it doesn't really feel unisex. Things feel too big to hold in my hand. Or when we were working on like VR stuff, I just remember like it was causing nausea to a lot of women. But then it's one of those things where it just wasn't being solved for. So I luckily met a guy who's a founder of a sex toy company. The company doesn't exist anymore, but I was like, how do you know what you're working on like works for women? And he was like, oh, the industry standard, you put it on your nose, and that's what a clitoris feels like. And I remember just being like, what? Like that's how we're testing sex toys. And every time a sex toy has not worked for me, which is already scary to have bought, and it doesn't work, and I feel like something's wrong with me, or like, oh my gosh, I must be broken because it works for everybody else but me. And I realized like it's just the design that's been really, I think, failing us. And so we kind of just started working on Lioness, and then as we were building it out, what people were looking for was more information about their body. And we realized in research, there's very little research on physiological sexual function, especially for women. And so
You don't have
it
to
just kind of all
tell
came
me
together.
about that,
Yeah,
Anna.
exactly. You're the
Or
pro
me.
of it.
Right.
Yes.
Ugh.
So, yeah, so that's kind of where we all started in terms of like, how do we give information to people of like data and like understanding their bodies and things like that.
So, given our circumstances now, I'm a little obsessed about,
Mm.
we're going into this basically, female not positive time politically. Are you seeing anything or feeling anything about how this is going to impact
Mm.
women in general and Linus users in particular?
It's a great question. I think I've been thinking about this for I think a long time now. I think especially as the elections were coming up and things like that. But I think the one big thing that I can take away is like my feelings of upsetness is similar to I think what it was even previously. I think the best way we could put it is like we're saying the quiet parts out loud now. I think is more of the thing. Like I think especially from our perspective of female sexual pleasure, I think there's going to be a lot of people impacted, obviously that have like women's health views that are going to be big, like hugely impacted. But I think female sexual pleasure wise, like it's always been a very stigmatized and very taboo area. It's always been kind of frowned upon as not a necessity in life. And so it's been a constant uphill battle. We've always been banned by things like Meta or TikTok, or trying to even open a bank account. Like there's been so many steps where we've seen that every step of the way, or investors being like, hey, like I love the product, but my partners are like extremely religious, for example, and being like, this is not something we can put in our portfolio and things like that. So I think we've seen it time and time and again. So I think the best way we could put it is that it's just the quiet parts being said out loud, and maybe in some way that's helpful because it's a conversation it's going to stir up, and there's going to be more conversations around, I think, this area. Like that's my kind of silver lining I'm hoping there is. But yeah, I don't know. I think no one really knows what's going to happen in the next few years of what it means for sexual wellness and sexual pleasure
Yeah.
and all that.
When we think of history and we look back, for example, during the Reagan administration, Republican administrations have typically been associated with a lot of activism.
Mm.
For women, it was for gays, for women, and all of that. So it's my hope that there's a lot of activism. And we had a guest on a couple weeks back, Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens, who has a book coming out called Good Sex, Stories, Science, and Sexual Liberation. And she made the point, which I loved, that I keep reiterating, is that by taking charge of our own pleasure, making sure that we're having sexual equality in our relationships and that we're pursuing pleasures as a healing force for ourselves in our relationships, that's the most powerful way that we can be effective in the world. So I
Mm-hmm.
love the idea that of this, like these topics and these issues are more important than ever. So I wanted to ask you, Anna, what do you learn from the orgasm data? And
Yes.
I know you're working with Celeste Tony's
Yes.
lab. I originally came to you because I think I was looking for a non-metal
Yeah.
vibrator for the scanner.
Yeah, for the scanner.
Yeah, yeah. So what are the orgasm data? What does it tell you? What does it tell people?
Yeah, also just to talk back on the non-metal vibrator, it's still like a very personal side project passion of mine. Like I just want to build it to know we can build it. And I don't know, like maybe in some world, like people will continue needing it. And I'm like, I just want to build one just for the sake. I think it'd be really fun.
Well,
But
for our viewers to understand the backstories, I did my dissertation work on orgasms in women, and I also on sexual imagery. And you cannot use anything with metal in
And
the
an MRI.
scanner, or you can have a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up having to use low tech clitoral stimulation by hand. And when we mapped the various body, the internal stuff, we made non metal devices so that we can map the connections with the cervix and the anterior wall of the vagina. So, that was a motivator, but it was really kind of hard for women to elicit and their partners to elicit orgasms through clitoral stimulation in a scanner because it's not a sexy space. And you can't communicate with the person giving you stimulation.
and you have to stay still, right? Like you can't be moving like in any like capacity.
Yeah, it took a lot of training. I still want to shout out to all of the brave women who came and donated
Yeah.
orgasms to science, and they practiced masturbating, keeping their heads still. We had this like really scary looking helmet that they would wear. We called it the Hannibal Lecter happy helmet that was looking scary looking. I'll share some pictures on social media. But like to me, it's just so heartwarming that women have continued to fight for the right to their body, to their reproductive health, to setting the record straight that our pleasure, our sexual pleasure, is not a luxury, it's a necessity, that we have
Yeah.
the right to all of that. So back to the orgasm data.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we've seen some really fun things within our research. One of the most fun things that we've been currently looking at is we were working with the pelvic floor therapist, Dee Hartman, and she's been really helpful in us in doing a lot of different interesting research, especially with the physiological data. So one of the big things that was published about 2 years ago now was on orgasm patterns. That was also led by Dr. Jim Faust of Prague University.
Love
and
him.
So yes, he's on. I like can read
And
papers
Dee.
for days. Yes, they're lovely, lovely
They
humans. And we were looking at orgasm patterns. So looking at the Lioness data of what, not patterns in terms of what type of orgasm you have, whether it's vaginal or clitoral or things like that, but the rhythm of how your pelvic floor muscles squeeze and relax. So we've kind of split them out into 3 different categories called the ocean wave, the volcano, and the avalanche. And so the ocean wave is the most common one we've seen. It's the one that's, I would say, even dating back to the 1980s from Boland's research, we've seen that there's like a very rhythmic squeeze and relax that happens, and it looks like a little nice ocean wave that goes up and down. Doesn't really change much in force over time. That's actually my pattern too. And And what we thought is that you can't really jump from one pattern to another pattern, but I'll get back to it after I explain the other two patterns. And then the other one is avalanche. It's similar to the squeeze and relax, but it starts much higher in force, and then it trickles down in force over time. So it slows down, though it gets a little bit weaker and weaker, and it slopes down. And then there's the volcano, which I always call like the very movie-esque kind of orgasm, where how they kind of replicate it in movies, where you see this huge explosion of force and then this huge drop in force over time. Less of this rhythmic movement that happens. It's actually the rarest one we've ever seen, and I always find it funny because I'm like, that's how they represent it in movies. So I feel like sometimes people can watch them being like, huh, mine doesn't feel like that, but it's probably because most people are not that pattern.
Anna,
so
do you know, is it possible for maybe that pattern to just be rare, but that everybody might be capable of it? Just, you know, thinking about my own experience, like it's not like that all the time, but maybe something crazy could happen and you could have that, and that's why it's rare.
Yeah. So what we're thinking is, previously in our data, we haven't really seen any data from jump from one pattern to another pattern, including myself. I've always been kind of an ocean wave. But there's definitely the thing of a lot of people writing in being like, hey, I promise I've had all, I just have not captured in the data. But maybe it's the way that I have, you know, for example, having partner sex, it looks very different. Or if I'm practicing edging, it could look very different. So I think it's absolutely possible.
What does it measure when you're having partnered sex?
Yeah, so it would need to be inserted anally or vice versa. Like, so it needs to be inserted in some way that it can be measuring those pelvic floor movements. The hope is to build another one that's more accessible, that's a little bit smaller, less intrusive if you want to have partner sex. But yeah, so we've definitely had people try that. Obviously, some people find it a little bit uncomfortable. It depends on just what your flavor for life is, and I think, but yeah, so I think it depends.
I think it's really interesting data, because sometimes, like, I talk about this a lot, like, it's not about the big O all the time. It's not about the volcanic orgasm, but we can even experience, you know, and that's pleasure in and of itself. And that's, I think, also what women tend to experience, where you have like multiple orgasms. It's probably those ocean-like ones, the wave, just like, you know, you're riding the wave. And that would be really interesting to measure in partnered sex, I think.
So too. I was just talking to Dr. Carol Queen, who was also at the Kinsey panel yesterday, and and one of the things we were saying is that we've seen consistently that things like edging or taking time to build up, we've seen the orgasms always tend to look longer, stronger, better. And she was like, that's like something that we don't talk about enough, is that time is a beautiful part of pleasure, that people think it needs to be like fast and get there quicker, but we've seen consistently that kind of taking your time and like really working on that buildup always has a better orgasm. So I think we could see more patterns arise, and people can have multiple. For example, for me, I've just this past year started seeing the avalanche type for me. So like having that trickle down over time. And so, and I don't know what is exactly the thing that's changing it, but it's kind of a fun, like self experiment to figure out.
My husband, who's data obsessed, would love this, and I would probably turn into a competition.
Yeah. You can have fun with it, you know. At the end of the day, it's sex. It's supposed to be fun.
Speaking,
you know, where mine
as
go ahead, Maureen.
You know. Well, as a physician who is also a sex counselor, who spends a lot of time with women who have never even touched their bodies sometimes. I mean, on the regular basis, I show people where their clitoris is and, you know, try to help them. I see women almost every day that have never had an orgasm, or at least have never had one partnered. I really think this data, I mean, I always encourage them to try to figure out what they like and how they feel, because it's less stressful if they can do it by themselves. But I really think this data can open up a ton of information and kind of like, I don't know, positive reinforcement for women to be able to do this and also to learn about their bodies and to be able to get there, because a lot of women even back down. I find that they can almost get there and then they're like afraid of the intensity and they back down. And I think I love this work because the number of women who struggle with this is somewhat mind-blowing to me, even though I've been doing this for 20 years. Like I love all this.
No, I think that's such a good point. Yeah, Nan, please.
What I was going to say is that when people aren't feeling safe, whether it's in their relationships with themselves or in the political climate, it's very hard to let go into pleasure. But the other thing that I was thinking about, you know, my researcher mind goes, oh, I wonder if we can get some men, if you can get a smaller version or a thinner version of this, so that we can study the male orgasm this way. Right now, my lab, we're looking at the brain data from men and women. And, you know, there are two significant differences between male and female orgasms, not qualitatively. If you ask people about, you know, in fact, Barry talks about Barry Komisarek, who I did my PhD with. You know, if you get descriptions of orgasms and you kind of you cover up what gender it is, what the genitals are, they sound very similar between men and women. But what we're looking at in brain data, we haven't published it yet, is that men, their brain activations go very steeply up, and then at the beginning of orgasm go very steeply down. So males tend to have shorter orgasms, and we also can, and they also have the refractory period. So that's a big difference between men and women that we're just sort of playing with to figure out what's maybe the central mechanism of this, you know, why men, and it seems like there's some inhibitory mechanisms that get kicked in with the orgasm that sort of maybe will translate into like a refractory period. But enough about that. But
that's really interesting, actually,
That is
because
interesting.
I'm sure that the data could also tell you about other things that are going on, right? Like, for example, if you have some problems experiencing orgasms, or if you suddenly see a change in your data, I'm sure there are other health indications or just lifestyle indications.
I love the idea of legitimizing this, that this is something worthy for women to take time to learn about their bodies. And you offer all sorts of stuff on your website, don't you, Anna?
Yeah.
In terms of, tell us about that for people who'd be interested in learning more about Lioness.
Yeah, I think, are you talking about like the sex experiments and things like that we do?
Yeah, all of that. Tell us everything.
Yeah, so one of the fun things, I think the thing that we always teeter in between is, I think at the end of the day, like the big thing is that sex should always be fun. Like at the end, that's like, you know, it should be fun, it's pleasurable, that's like the main basis. The approach that we take to get to is obviously a much nerdier, less sexy way, but sometimes you kind of need that introduction of like the information, the data, learning about your body to get to a pleasurable and like a very fun experience. And so one of the fun ways we're doing it is we call it sex experiments. We started it in April of this past year. So every month we introduce like a fun like project. For example, like everyone this month try it with drinking caffeine right before and then using the Lioness. Tell us if that data looks different. We'll do like a
question.
End of the
Sorry
month report.
Yeah,
no, please.
Does it actually work, the caffeine?
So I personally I'm a super big fan of caffeine. I always tell people, like, if you're not actually alcohol has always been pretty bad, but I always say caffeine is a really accessible one. It kind of makes it like shorter but stronger, like a very sharp kind of orgasm. Obviously it's not across the board. We have in the data, it was like a little bit different in terms of the orgasm, like how intense it was, but it wasn't a huge significant difference. I would say like some of the interesting ones that we've done that has been the most impactful have been edging is like by far very important, very, very interesting. I think it just, the orgasm length, the quality, how people star rate it, like all those things are just so vastly different. One that we haven't done as a sex experiment, we probably will never push like on our platform, but I would say like anecdotally, I think like THC has always been also very, very interesting one. Whether in a lubricant form or if you ingest it in some way, the orgasm just always looks super, super
It's
interesting.
funny
So I always say, if you,
you mention
Yeah.
this because next
yeah.
week our guest is
Yeah.
Dr. Suzanne
Mhm.
Mulvihill, who's the
Mhm.
founder of the Female Orgasm Research Institute. And she's going to talk about her journey of finally discovering her own orgasm with and through cannabis. And now she and other people like me are petitioning states
Yes.
to include female orgasm disorder as a condition for prescribing medical marijuana. Because I will tell you personally and professionally, there's nothing out there that the drug companies have put out that work for female sexual desire or female orgasm challenges. Okay. I've
It's hard to
reviewed
treat.
I've reviewed the studies of Addie and Vyleesi, and they call them statistically significant, but I don't think that they're clinically significant. They got a lot of side effects and a lot of downside. But I will tell you that a little bit of marijuana, and I'm talking about not necessarily getting so high that you are, floating around the room, but a little bit of marijuana for some women in particular who are not orgasmic can do a world of good. And I will also say that it's consistently useful for people who don't have adverse effects. Like some people just can't do it, but a little bit of marijuana can actually activate your sexual desire. So I am committed to making this available. And like of course they're going to want to make drugs that will be able to be patented and people can make money on and probably do a lot of, like getting rid of a lot of the benefits of cannabis medically. But we'll stay tuned for that. But the enhancing sensations.
Yeah.
So what you're really saying, Anna, that one takeaway for everybody, men and women probably, is the idea of taking your time,
Yeah.
being in the experience. One of the things that I've always been interested in is there are people who have orgasms that are not pleasurable, and there are people who don't have orgasms that experience more pleasure. So it's the goal of orgasm, having the goal be orgasm. Beverly Whipple used to talk about that. If you don't know who she is listening, she's one of the world's top sex scientists, and she was my mentor. That when you are goal directed with sex and you're looking to create a bigger, better orgasm, or having an orgasm, you're focusing on the orgasm, it's going to take you out of the experience. So taking your time, savoring the sensations. I also find that people who can breathe, really like work with your breath, can intensify the pleasure that they're feeling and kind of get into the physiology. So what's next for you, Anna? This is like we're thinking about the new ground for all of us. What's next for you?
Yeah, I think for us, we're continuing to figure, I think especially for us, because we have such a large data set and now we have these experiments happening, one of the big things we want to start understanding is, one, continuing to do research in whatever capacity that we can, but also kind of creating journeys for people in terms of like, well, what is the journey that caters to this person specifically that does help them get onto this like path of exploration, feeling comfortable, feeling curious about their body. I think the big thing that we want to encourage is like being forever curious about your body. Of like, I do it too. It's like once you kind of know what you like and you're not into, like you kind of end up staying in that same routine. So for a lot of people, it can get a little stale or not something as exciting. But we want to keep introducing like that curiosity of like, well, like what is it like if I do it in the morning versus nighttime? Like, what is it like if I drink coffee? And you might learn things that you don't know. And the cool thing for me is like one of the big things that I've seen is stress. Stress will kill like your orgasms, what it looks like, even from a physiological perspective. For me, like it will turn into the smallest blip ever. And you can feel it, but just seeing it in your data, it makes me feel
you're like
normal.
ugh.
Yeah.
So
But
how do you track your stress? Do you
Yeah.
use another tracking device?
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
have an Aura ring,
Yeah.
and then also at the first time I actually experienced it was a few years ago. I was doing like the full panel thing, so where you like spit into the thing throughout the day, and then you take
Okay.
a blood draw throughout the day. And I like that was the day that I had a Linus. I like used the Linus, so I had also seen that data. And one of the things I learned was like I just had crazy cortisol levels that specific day. And then just seeing it also in my data throughout the month of just like seeing this very small blip. And I couldn't figure out what was causing it. And then I realized like, oh my gosh, I've been so stressed this past month. Like it might be stress. And I think I'm fairly sure of it because I know that anytime I get to the point where I feel very like that humming stress where you're just constantly something's on your mind. And I like it was such an important thing for me to learn of like being like, hey, when this is happening, like everything sex wise is just like out the window. Like I don't feel like in myself. And it used to add to the stress of being like, oh my God, something's wrong with my body now. And like, how am I going to be, you know, running this company and like promoting, like trying to encourage sex when I'm not even having it or I'm not even feeling my space to do it. So I think stress is such a big one that we've really come into. But so I think it's really helping people from what we've learned from people's stories, people's like the data that we've collected, the research that we've done. How do we create these journeys for people, for example, like people that might never had an orgasm? Like what is the path that really helps them get to that point? Or if you've used to have one and then suddenly it might have disappeared, like how do you kind of refine that and things like that? So I think just the big thing of figuring out ways to ignite curiosity for
I
people,
love
like
that.
just
I
little
love
fun
that.
things.
That's the seeking system powered by dopamine that gets hijacked by our social media devices when we get, you know, we spend way too much time doom scrolling. So if we can get curious and kind of you know, that seeking system is really there to help us learn and help us focus on things that feel good and good for us. And I will say that an orgasm a day might make the doctor go away. No offense, doctors,
No,
but you
it's
know,
okay. And I was going to say, though, even though those orgasms, you know, I mean, I get it. But even though those orgasms are not quite as good, I mean, they're still good for you in that time, right? Like we know that having an orgasm actually completes the stress cycle.
Yeah.
So even if they're subpar, like I want to advocate for people to still go do it when you're stressed, because it's actually good for you to do that.
I have a winter report from a couple I work with. So I work with a lot of young couples with kids who are stressed out of their minds, who are stressed out about all sorts of things. And we worked on a plan for this. The woman, it was a heterosexual couple. She did an orgasm a day, and she did that for about 3 or 4 weeks. And when they had a session yesterday, they both showed up smiling. And she says, this really worked. Now, we know that have sexual stimulation and orgasm releases testosterone. And testosterone is the, you know, hormone that drives sex drive in both men and women. We know from all sorts of brain research, like I did, well, there isn't really a lot of brain research. It's probably just us.
There's not a lot of
What
research in general.
what gets released in the brain through sexual stimulation, orgasm are feel good for you peptides, you know? So we always keep saying we're going to do an orgasm a day. I say that, and to tell you honestly, I haven't been sticking to my intention, and I think I really need this. I got very motivated when I saw my clients and how good they looked. I'm like, oh, and I think I got because you know I got a multi-generational house with a little baby
That's the
here.
problem.
Yeah.
That's
I get rid of my kids or my job, one or the other.
Yeah, we're not used to having people around. So I have my kids and my grandchild, and it's like just doesn't feel like. Does Mimi Nan really go upstairs and give herself an orgasm now? But you know what? If we thought about it, you know, we take our vitamins or we do things that are good for us. And I'm making the commitment again, I think that it's something that I'd like to power into for to treat my own anhedonia, which is challenges having pleasure, which is a cause of stress and a result of stress and anxiety and all of that. So
women experience,
Everybody's stressed.
now,
Everybody's stressed and everybody's
But
anxious.
I do
From my
have
perspective,
sorry,
it's mind blowing. 20 years ago, it wasn't like that.
But I do wonder if there are also physiological reasons. So, for example, is there a correlation that you find between pelvic floor strength and orgasms?
We haven't looked very closely at it. I think the closest one, the research that we've seen is one that D. Hartman did last year, was seeing from different age ranges what orgasms look like. And I think the fun part of it was that I think it was 50 plus, or maybe it was 40. I think it was 50 plus tend to have stronger orgasms, but it takes longer to get there. Yeah, so I was saying actually there's something, I think, one, beautiful of like, I think as we age, the orgasms get better over time. And it also can be that I think you learn to know your body a little bit better.
Yes.
You kind of are experiencing, you take your time. Maybe, and so that was like the thing we're saying, like, maybe it's not that they're taking a longer time to get there. Maybe they're taking their time to enjoy it, and that's why their orgasms actually look better. But so we've seen it in that sense of like the pelvic floor function. Another really interesting one that we've been working on is she's been doing where people come into her office, and then she'll do pelvic floor exams and then show them how to do a specific Kegel exercise, and then afterwards use the Lioness while the Lioness is inserted, and then she'll also have them go home and do a masturbation session, but also add those Kegel exercises before the masturbation session. And so one of the interesting things we've seen is that however hard you can squeeze, just like your own voluntary Kegel squeeze, we've seen orgasms, there's a statistical significance of how much stronger you can squeeze during an orgasm that is involuntary. And so we were saying that there's something very powerful. I think there's just so much about the orgasm that's just not studied. Amazing. And how much of the pelvic floor muscle can change. And then we're seeing that the relaxation, the resting tone of the pelvic floor muscles can really relax much lower than what it was at previously post-orgasm. There's a lot of fun things I think I'm really excited to see in terms of especially pelvic floor health as well, of like how it all kind of comes together.
So the more that you can tone the pelvic floor, the more that is available. Well, we know from, history of research that, pelvic floor health is a very important thing. Not just, and I'm sure Maureen can talk about this, from urinary incontinence to, now we know that as women age, and Maureen happens to be a certified menopause expert. Do we add that to your list there, Maureen?
No, but
can you talk to us
I
a little bit about the aging aspects of sexuality for women? I could say on the other side of menopause, you can have some really good sex, so you don't have to feel like you can't.
It sounds like it 50 plus.
Yeah, you definitely can. Physiologically, in a quick nutshell, when our ovaries stop producing eggs, because that's really what causes menopause, we have they kind of disappear, and over time the ovary, which is an endocrine organ, also stops making testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. The problem is that we have estrogen receptors everywhere in our body, and it's a pretty abrupt change. There's some very intense estrogen receptors in the urethra, the bladder, the vagina, the vestibule, which is the surrounding opening. And so with time, if you're not repleting some of that estrogen, you have a very specific change to the tissues there. You have an increase in mechanoreceptors inside the bladder, which makes the bladder more irritable. You have less ability to fight off infection, but you can have changes, including like not as great blood supply or blood flow, which is what's needed for orgasm and arousal. So those physiologic changes can be lousy. You can counteract a lot of them just with some topical estrogen, which is 100% safe. A topic for another day, but I'm pretty passionate about making sure everyone is using that for multiple reasons. But yeah, as you age, there's that. There's also that decline of testosterone, which is another struggle that women have. And that's a big struggle, because there's not an FDA approved product at the dose that women need, but there's a lot of data and research that show it's safe, and it helps with low desire in postmenopausal women to replete that. So anyway, But yes, so we do see sometimes a change in focus too in orgasm, at least in my clinical experience, is that women become a little more dependent on clitoral stimulation for orgasm in menopause. But I don't care how you get there. I just want people to get there and have pleasure.
Yeah.
And I'd add to that it's an adaptation. So it is organ failure of your ovaries, and there are a lot of people have a whole bunch of side effects, right?
Oh God, yeah.
But I will tell you there are compensatory mechanisms that are just beginning to be understood. For example, the brain actually has estrogen receptors that become more receptive to estrogen after menopause. So it's compensating for the fact that we're making less estrogen. So I think there's a kind of wisdom in the body, and I think a lot of what drives the fear for women about menopause is they don't have good information. They stop thinking about hormone replacement therapy as in years. They went crazy saying it was bad. They were pushing on everybody, and then they said nobody should do it.
We could give a
we don't
master class on that. Yeah, that's 20 years of women that were terrified for literally no good reason.
Yeah.
It's so sad. And I think if you can get through the symptomatic part, and you also have a mental map that it doesn't mean you go into sexual retirement, old equals ugly. I think ageism is more of an issue for women than menopause.
I mean, society, I mean, we could be blue in the face talking about like all the expectations society has on women, our aesthetic, like our own body image can kill our libido and drive and interest in sex more than like a whole laundry list of other things. But we try to live up to the standard that society has said, oh, this is what makes you pretty or attractive. And it's ingrained so deeply in so many people that it's a struggle to get people to kind of let that go sometimes. So,
from an evolutionary perspective, our worth as women, right, our mate value is our physical attractiveness, which translates to youth. So how youthful our appearance is to signal to men that we are fertile. So I think menopause has this like huge weight on us because we know that that's when we lose our mate value.
Well, that's being an object. So I think women are objectified, and we don't get trained or given permission to be in our bodies as the participants rather than to own our own
or honestly
pleasure.
to have to be able to make your own decisions about your own body. You know what I mean? Like that's a real fear going forward, and depending on what state you live in, it can be a problem for you too. There's not a lot of research out there about there's not a lot of research out there like sexual health research, how the physiology of orgasm and arousal and all that stuff is very new. And especially in like things that aren't new, like menopause and women's health problems, there's a very big lack of good research that helps us, that's specific to us and the things that we experience, such as menopause and our orgasms, which, are just for pleasure and don't have any like reproductive specific need like an ejaculate. This is why I'm so excited about your product. Like this is why I'm so excited about the research, how it's empowering women, how they're getting to learn about their bodies, how we're starting to figure out in a way that can be pleasurable for women more about our orgasms. Like this is really exciting stuff for those of us in the world of trying to help people have orgasms.
But also younger women, because it's actually research shows that it's single women that experience less orgasms when they're having sex with a partner, right?
Heterosexual women in general losing the orgasm gap. We got to fix that.
And younger women who feel more insecure about their bodies, right? So they're more in their heads. So I think this data could be so cool for any woman to find out more about her body and get more in touch with herself and what works and what doesn't.
And one of the things I always like to bring up is the sexual recession. Do you know that it's real? There are a lot of people, younger people in particular, that are not having sex. And it's actually the older people, the boomers, believe it or not,
We're having
that seem to have less mental
a lot
health challenges right now and probably having more sex than their kids.
Actually, I always tell people that our biggest purchasing demographic group is, oh, it's not the younger generation of people. Like, I think that's what people always expect because it's like a high tech product, it has AI and all of these things, but it's not the people that are purchasing. I think it's very telling, and I think the people that reach out and have questions or the ones that are the most enthusiastic don't tend to actually be like that, especially the Gen Z kind of age group. But it's a yeah, that's something that I think about a lot of like it's like a pendulum swing of I think how much we're responding to I think the political times and also just how much anxiety and all these things that are there, and figuring out what it means for I think sexual pleasure, like I guess pleasure is always the first thing that kind of goes in terms of like the necessities of life and things like that. So it's interesting to kind of observe from like a bigger picture of I think what's I think happening and what it means in terms of yeah, like I think in the sex toy world, especially for our industry, like there's been so much strides that have been made. We're seeing so many incredible companies that have come up in this space and that really represent bodies and different like different walks of life that haven't been previously catered to in terms of sex toys, and we've made such a big stride in that. And seeing, for example, we ran our first Meta ad and it got approved like 3-4 months ago, and that's something that was never heard of, and just seeing something like that and what it means, I think on a bigger picture of like, yeah, did we reach kind of how far we could go in terms of how much sex toys have gone, and then we're going to see a little bit of pushback before we can even go further ahead. It's a little bit of a fear.
Last but not least, Anna, we didn't really talk about Femtech. So
Oh,
can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about what Femtech is and kind of how we can, maybe support it?
Yeah, so Femtech is the overarching kind of term that was started by Ida Tin, of the founder of Clue app, which is the period tracking app. It's incredible. They also just do incredible amounts of research for especially female sexual function, and all of that. And so the term femtech and then sex tech was coined by Cindy Gallup, who's also an incredible force in the sex tech space, with her company Make Love Not Porn. And so I would say femtech is the overarching of just working on technologies that help female health, overall wellness, and things like that. It's still fairly, I would say it's still very new in terms of industry wise. There's a lot more companies coming up in this space. It's kind of notoriously known as a very difficult space to grow a company in. It's always a tough space to get funding. I think because the people that are investors tend to be males. So a lot of times they don't understand kind of the female body or what's important, what needs to be researched, why we're building products that are all sorts of things. And I think even every day I'm surprised, I learn so much just from like my femtech founder friends who are telling me like what medical tools are used and what year they were invented and why it's so backwards and why we're still using them to this day. Like I'm just constantly learning about all the gaps that I think are in women's health as a whole. So femtech is, yeah, it's, I like every day I'm like, I can't believe I have not ever learned this about my own body, or like, yeah, just things that I wouldn't know to like ask at a doctor's office or anything like that. And so, yeah, it's a new area. I think the best way I think people can support it is finding femtech companies that are doing incredible things and just supporting, whether they have products or following their account or just anything. I think is a huge support because it is a very new space. So all companies tend to be quite small. And the goal is to continue having these like breaking the glass ceilings for these unicorn companies that are, valued at billions of dollars, so that more eyes are on this space and more eyes are on this industry being like, yes, this is a place that we need to be funding and continue to supporting. So sex tech falls under that category as well. Sometimes I'd like to think of us as like the odd middle child maybe is of the group, because we're kind of doing it tends to be a little bit siloed depending on the groups and how comfortable they are about talking about sex and orgasms and pleasure and all of that. But we're all in one big happy family, I would say. but we're like middle children.
That's wonderful. We just got a comment from one of our viewers. Thank you for having this discussion. I'm 72 years old and I'm all about lifelong learning, especially about my own body.
Love it.
So there's such gaps in science and medicine about the female body. It wasn't properly studied. They did all the studies, like, lab rats. They only use male lab rats a lot. And when you have male researchers handling rats, the rats have stress reactions. So,
oh, interesting.
There's so many variables to consider. So this is just the beginning of a very important time. In spite of politics, what are our takeaways? Pleasure, taking our time, and having really good sexual pleasure is a political force, is a health force, right?
Less stress.
Less stress, an orgasm a day.
Exploring your
body.
And don't be afraid to age, because sex gets better after 50,
it does.
apparently.
It can, but it's the sad thing is a lot of people think old is ugly and that you have to go into sexual retirement, and we're sexual beings. The capacity to have pleasure within in our bodies.
And how great that you don't even have to think about birth control anymore, right?
I'm so glad that part of my life is over. I can't even begin to tell you.
I love Anna, what's the best way for people to kind of find your product and kind of learn about the smart vibrator and everything? Where do you want to send people who want to maybe participate in the experiment?
Great sex experiments.
Yes.
So yeah, it'll be on this account that I'm on is Lioness Health, and then it'll lead you to our website, which is lioness.io. It's the perfect place. We have tons of articles. We have tons of things of weird, like random things we've learned, fun data tidbits that we've learned over the years. And then you can also, I have my personal Instagram that is actually be on the profile of the Lioness Instagram. Anna is average. And then I also just do like really silly sex experiments for myself. And then I'll always show my data and like what I've learned and takeaways and all that fun stuff.
I love it.
Anna, you're not at the top of the bell curve. I got to tell you, you are like far to the side. You're anything but average.
I appreciate it.
What is the Anna is average tagline? How did that happen?
Let's unpack your need to be average.
So in college, the first year when we like entered the dormitories, we all had to do like the icebreaker where you have to say like the first letter of your name with like an adjective. And I thought I was being really funny. I was like being snarky. I was like, oh, I want to be like Anna average. But clearly the way that I said it, I think everybody had the same reaction as you, was like, oh my gosh, you're not average. Like, let's think of other words that start with an A. And it like horrified me to my core. And I just think it's still funny to this day that I'm like, I promise I was trying to be funny and I'm clearly not funny, which is an F. So anyways.
But I think it is fun to play with and to be silly. And, like comedy is important. We need to be fun and to have fun and be funny too. So
I've been like, sex is fun. Like, I think at the end of the day, yes, it's wellness. Yes, it's all these things, but it's fun. Period. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Anna, I'd love to have you back.
Yes, anytime.
Anything that you want to talk about, the next leg of the journey, what's happening with the company, what's happening with you.
Love it. I know. I feel like we could talk. The four of us could talk for hours on it. I want to hear more things from your. I have so many things I want to ask and all that stuff.
And I keep thinking about, like how can we study men's orgasms with your product? The researcher in me is never. I'm going to talk to Barry about this.
I'm sure developing a plug. Would be really into monitoring their sex data.
Developing a plug.
Yeah. That'd be really cool.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Anna.
Have a wonderful weekend.
Go have lots of fun.
Yay!
Lots of orgasms.
Peace out and over, as they say.
Bye. Lots of orgasms to everyone.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you.